In this video, we're going to talk about using CSS files rather than CSS code embedded in the head of an HTML page, and then we're going to learn how to use these files throughout a website. First, let me just talk about the materials that I'm going to be using in this video. I have one web page here, and this is the typical one that we've been working with so far in this class. And then I have a second web page that I've made that just is very bare bones. It does have its HTML coded in there, just the basic HTML, but that's it. And so it's looking like this. So these two pages are going to be part of a single site that we're going to work on for the purposes of this video. And of course, we have images that go along with these, including the background images here, as well as just the plain old content images that are on each of the pages. Okay, now what we want to do is have a similar look to both of these pages, and then make some modifications between them for sure. But we want to start out by having a lot of the basics the same between both of these files. Now, one thing we could do, I could go in here and I could copy this code and I could paste it in the other page. Okay, that's fine, that'll work. But every time I want to make an adjustment to my CSS, I'll have to update it now in two different places. And that's really not how we want it to work. We want to be able to have a central location for our CSS style where we can make one change, one edit, and then have that edit conveyed across all the places, all the instances where that coding is used. So in order to do that, what we really want to do is take our CSS and put it into its own file and then link that file to each of our pages, just like we link images. A little bit different in the coding, but same idea, where we want to use a pointer to target that CSS file rather than having the CSS just right there in the head of the HTML. This is also going to make our HTML a lot cleaner. We'll be able to reduce the size of it, getting all of this stuff out of here and into its own file. So first thing I'm going to do is copy the CSS code. Now notice I am not copying the opening and closing style tags, because remember, the style tag, that belongs with HTML. Right now, all I want is CSS. In order to do this, I'm just opening a new notepad file, and that's, again, all I need is just a plain old notepad file. I'm going to paste my CSS in here. Okay. And now here's the really important bit. When I go under File, Save As, just like when we're working on our HTML files, we go under Save As. It's really important to have that .html extension on those web pages. Similarly, when we're dealing with this, it's very important to have a .css extension. Now notice I have, according to best practice, I've made a little folder for my CSS files. So I'm going to go there, and I'm going to call this one mainstyle.css. And go ahead and save that. So now I have a file here called main style. I'm going to come back over here and I'm actually going to delete all the style coding out of my HTML file. Okay, now I've got all the code out of there just to prove that we have in fact modified this HTML page. So you can see all of the CSS is gone now. We're going to put it back though with one line of code. And we're going to use a new way of linking to a file, the link tag. And this is another one that is just a single tag. It doesn't have a beginning and an end. It's just a single tag. And it needs a property called rel, which is relationship. And in this case, we want it to be a style sheet. So we're going to tell it it's a style sheet. And then we do use the href, just like with the A tag, we're using the href. And remember, we want to go down a folder from where we are in our hierarchy. We're here on web page 08, and we want to go down to CSS. So we are going to say CSS and then /, and then we called it mainstyle.css. So we've linked that up, and now when I reload this page, it should restore all of these styles, all exactly the same. It should restore them all. And then when we reload this page, it should restore all the CSS code. Now it did, but with one key exception. It hasn't restored our images. Why? Well, we moved the file essentially, right? We took something that was, we had the code in here, which was in this spot in our hierarchy in relation to images. And now though, our CSS file is located here, which means we actually need to get back up to this level before we can make our images appear. So we need to go into our CSS file, and any place we see that we are using images, we need to add in a little bit of code to get us back up into that root folder before it will then seek the images folder and find those files. So we basically broke our images by moving the file, but that's easily enough fixed. And again, in the real world, you would be starting coding your CSS in a separate file, so you wouldn't actually run into this problem. But it's a good problem to run into because then I can show you how to troubleshoot it. Okay, so now, having saved that file, we have our images restored. We can use a separate file for all of our CSS code. It functions in exactly the same way. All we need in our HTML file is one single line of code instead of all that stuff junking up the head of our file. So that's great. That's exactly what we want. Notice the other very cool thing is now I can take this one line of code and I can put it into any other page and I can generate the same CSS styling. So let's say here, I'm putting it into my 09 page, which is this one. And look at that, just like that. Suddenly this one has all of that same styling as the other one. I didn't have to do any of that hard work that we did on the first one. It's just all automatically there. And we can now apply custom classes that we have in this CSS page on this file, just because this link is already established. So let's say here in our image, we want to use our class equals left, and then here class equals right, and we get the nice wrapping that we coded in to our CSS. So even custom classes, everything carries over just exactly as if all that code was sitting in the head of your file. Now, if I want to change something in my CSS, this is another great thing, right? So let's say we don't like that oval look in our images after all. So we want to get rid of this, or at least we want to make it a more subtle border radius. So let's go ahead, I'm making that change, and then let's return to our HTML file. And look what happens, right? It changes it here, and it changes it here. Now, once you start moving your CSS into a separate page, this is where your Reload CSS plugin really could come in handy. Sometimes, if your browser is using a cached version of the file, a version that's sitting in its memory, it won't actually reload and make the changes that you're making to your CSS unless you explicitly force it to use a new copy. So that's where the Reload CSS browser plugin comes in handy. That shows you how to use an external CSS file, and then you can make changes to that file that will cascade throughout the entire website wherever that is applied. Now, one other thing that's really neat and that's very powerful about CSS is that we can stack our CSS files to make individual changes for specific pages. So let's say on this page, we want to use a different background on the page. So let's go ahead and start a new CSS file. And we're going to call this MOV style for Merchant of Venice style.css. Okay, now I'm going to remove the background image that is there rather than simply reassign one. And then I'm going to use a background color instead. Okay, so I've coded in a little bit of CSS here. Now, all I would need to do is add another link tag here. Same deal, rel style sheet. This time, of course, I want it to be MOV style.css. Now, this is one of the times when it is really important the order in which things appear. So when this page is rendering, it's going to apply all of these styles, and then because it's hitting this file second, it will apply any of these styles to overwrite or supersede any styling that was listed in this page. So you can essentially use a subsequent CSS file and just modify the pieces that you want to modify. So it's going to keep everything from here except for the things that are superseded by this file. So in this case, it should keep everything the same, all the styling the same, except that it's going to change the background of the body from an image to a background color. And you can see we've done exactly that. The background image goes away, and we have a background color here now. You know, hopefully you're starting to see the logic of how this works, and ideally what you want to do is put together all of the main CSS features for your site into your main CSS file, and that one's going to go on every single page, and it will have big bulk of the CSS styling. And then to make modifications, individual modifications in maybe certain sections of the site or on certain pages, or just to make create a certain effect, you can layer additional style sheets. And again, you don't want to go crazy. I mean, you know, maybe having 5 style sheets would be too many, but certainly having a main one and a second one to make the modification specific to a certain page isn't overwhelming. And again, it makes your job as a coder a heck of a lot easier to be using these separate external pages. So that should give you a good sense of how to create standalone CSS files, how to link them to pages in your website, and how to stack them in order to create individualized effects on different pages of your site.